Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, Russian President Vladimir Putin announces the immediate partial military mobilization of Russian citizens. What's next in the ongoing war in Ukraine? World leaders gather for the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly to counter global challenges. How can the problems be solved? Now on Dialogue Weekend.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qindu. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced the country's first partial military mobilization since World War II, with some 300,000 reservists expected to be initially called up. The announcement comes after Russia has experienced military setbacks in the conflict and a vote inside the Russian-controlled areas to break away from Ukraine. Why the mobilization now? What is the situation on the ground? And could annexing parts of Ukraine lead to escalation of the war? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined today by Professor Huang Jing, Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies at Shanghai International Studies University, Mark Sloboda, Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst, Professor Dov Toker, American Graduate School in Paris, and Anna Tangen, current affairs commentator. Welcome to the show. Mark, I will start with you. Why does Russia need to mobilize the troops at this stage? So what's the consideration behind the timing, let's say?
Okay, so the timing, of course, has to do with the counteroffensive that the West-backed Kiev Putsch regime forces have started to wage with a new strategy, as CNN openly admits, war-gamed and planned out by the Pentagon, whereby the newly trained, equipped, and salaried Kiev regime forces by the West will basically attack everywhere at once in mass human wave tactics. And Russia, with its special military operation limited by its own legal self restrictions to just 150,000 troops, with an added 40 to 50,000 East Ukrainians fighting alongside against the regime, simply lacks the manpower to defend everywhere at once. It forced them to withdraw from Kharkov, and this granted the Kiev regime a big propaganda victory. I think that the Kremlin recognizes at last that it is in fact at war with NATO at this point. I mean, when we have a Kiev regime force that is funded, trained, armed, salaried, getting the intelligence, the battlefield direction from the CIA and European commandos on the ground, as the Washington Post has written about, it's really a Ukrainian army in name only. And Russia feels it necessary to have the reservists to bolster their professional contract army so that they can defend territory, while the army that is engaged now will continue with its offensive operations to liberate the rest of the Donbass.
Professor Toker, some say the mobilization shows the incapacity of a Russian military or is less likely to produce the desired results on the battlefield due to the lack of training. They are reservists, they are not professional soldiers. Others attributed to the lack of morale among the Russian soldiers. What do you make of these assessments?
Well, there's certainly a large amount of truth and factual reality in these assessments. Yes, we saw over the 7 months now on the battlefield that there are manifestly problems on the Russian operational side when it comes to logistics, when it comes to morale, when it comes to the capacity to have sufficient battlefield flexibility qualities in order to adjust situations to some incoming new elements on the battlefield. Now, we should all keep in mind, because having heard my colleague in Moscow, one could have thought that all that, sort of came out of the blue. I mean, we cannot, of course, disconnect the overall appreciation of the situation, including the capacities of the Russian military, from point one of the situation, namely the fact that there was and there is a Russian aggression crossing border, violating the sovereignty of Ukraine, and creating the situation we are into, unfortunately, right now, based most probably on anticipations on the Russian side, which are not parallel to what we see on the battlefield. So yes, the situation has changed. Yes, there are some deficiencies in the performances that we see regarding the capabilities of the Russian military to operate successfully in the terrain. And this is why President Putin was more or less obliged to adjust the situation, among other things, with this exceptional mobilization act.
Mm-hmm. Professor Huang Jing, as Mark has pointed out, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu has also said, Russia is at a war, not with Ukraine, but with the collective West. So, with the latest move of mobilizing the reservists in Russia, what do you make of the situation?
I think that the Russians, in my view, send a clear message to NATO and to the United States that if they continue to involve in this war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia is ready to escalate the war. And one. Number two is that because of vote going on, those breakaway territories will belong to Russia, will be Russian territories. In Russian constitution, that will justify or legitimize all means of war, all means of weapons being used in the war to defend Russia, to defend motherland. So if we do not make any value judgment on this, I read this partial mobilization as Russians, ready to really fight this war through to the end to achieve its purposes. Whether it can be successful or not, that's another story. But right now, to the current situation, to me, it's very clear that is Russia is going to upgrade or escalate this war and to achieve whatever it has designed in the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very serious message.
Yeah, and with this mobilization, escalation of the conflict, and also are we seeing the Ukraine crisis now is as a long haul?
Yeah, it is a long haul. I mean, these declarations of victory by either side are pointless. Russia will not be satisfied until it has a sense of its security guarantees. And, Ukraine won't be satisfied until they believe that they have their country back. So at this juncture, the only thing that made sense, which would have made sense before all the fighting began, is rather than trying to push NATO in there, to simply create a buffer zone around Russia, not have troops going eyeball to eyeball, not having missiles being pointed at each other, and just simply say, if you want to join NATO, that's fine, but you cannot start putting military installations and directly threatening Russia. This idea that NATO is a defensive alliance, well, it's a defensive alliance aimed at one country. So I doubt that is, very valid. It's really disheartening to hear this talk about victories. There's no victory. There are people who died in these assaults on both sides. In the end, it will amount to the same. There will be no cessation until there is security provided to Russia, and there's nothing else you can say about it. The question is, when do we arrive at this point of sanity?
Russian-controlled area of eastern Ukraine are holding a vote to break away from Ukraine and join Russia. So, Mark, there were talk of a referendum quite a long ago. What is the timing? What's behind the timing? Let's say, what's the consideration?
First of all, full disclosure, I have family in East Ukraine. My wife is Crimean, and we have family in the Donbass as well as Kharkov and Odessa. I'm hardly objective on that matter, but the people of East Ukraine, people of Donbass, have wanted to break away and rejoin Russia since 2014, when the government that they democratically elected was overthrown by a violent and unconstitutional openly West-backed putsch. But I think there is some recent, certainly, desire to speed up the process because of the demonstration of what happened in Kharkov when Russian forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered and withdrew in order to prevent a military defeat, but that sacrificed the people of the Kharkov region to the tender mercies of Kraken and Azov and the other state-armed and funded neo-Nazi battalions. The Kiev regime's State Bureau of Investigation announced the filtration of the citizens of Kharkov to root out all collaborators and sympathizers. I mean, this was openly announced. And by the Kiev regime's draconian laws, any citizen who even so much as accepts humanitarian aid, food and medicine from a Russian is a collaborator. So there is all kinds of grim stories coming out of there. And quite frankly, the people of the Donbass and South Ukraine are terrified that this could also happen to them. So they want the protection of Russia extended over them so that the Banderites and the regime that arms and funds them does not come back.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, of course, there's condemnation and criticism from the West on the Russian move. But what else do we expect? Are we expecting more sanctions? And how possible is it, the referendum after they become part of Russia in the Russian territory and attacks on the Russian territory could be, say, have maybe the US or the European countries get directly involved in the confrontation with Russia?
Well, hopefully this is not going to be the case, but indeed, the idea or the initiative or the speculations as to those referendums to take place in the eastern provinces of Ukraine is very alarming. But it is unfortunately in the continuity of what we have been seeing over these last 7 months and earlier. Actually, you can start the countdown in this sense all the way back to 2014. What we see is a challenge, a major challenge, to some extent unprecedented challenge on international order. Now, there has been already, and still is, a challenge on what an international border means. There has been, and there still is, a challenge as to what is the actual meaning of national sovereignty. If we're going to see this caricature, I'm afraid, of letting people vote or announcing that people are voting and then counting the votes and basing, trying to install political positions and military behavior on the basis of what the popular wish of the population in those provinces seem to indicate, we're going to see one step further in this farce, I'm afraid I have to say, of what the conventional tools of politics and international relations are supposed to be. How can you handle a vote in regions which are under fire at part, which have seen massive moves of population eastwards and westwards for different reasons in relation with the movements of troops and political intentions and manipulations, and how can you have any basic trust in the so-called democratic process which will be taking place perhaps in the ballot boxes of these regions? So this is Western leaders have actually said that very clearly and are absolutely agree amongst themselves that this is absolutely unacceptable. Now, what would the Russian regime do with results of such referendums if they do take place is indeed alarming.
Mm-hmm. Of course, this is a war, and this is a serious confrontation, between not only Russia and Ukraine, but also Russia and the West. So, Professor Huang Jing, we are seeing, if you look at the recent progress being made by the Ukrainians, there's of course, arms from from the U.S., from European countries, and also the direct involvement of intelligence support, and also the design even or the planning for the offensive by the Pentagon. So that's probably why Russians said that almost a direct involvement of the U.S. I mean, how possible, how likely is there a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, or Russia and the U.S.?
I think that it is a fact that indeed NATO and the United States is very massively, heavily involved into this confrontation. But in the larger picture that, ever since disintegration of Soviet Union, the Russian leaders from Yeltsin to Putin the first term really tried to integrate Russia into the Europe. But that effort was kind of, rejected very brutally. And ever since 2008, we know 2008, the anti-missile system was deployed in Poland, and also Ukraine officially applied to join in the NATO. That's a turning point that makes Russians realize that this US-led international orders will not accept them, no matter what. They will not be in this part of international order. That's why they also say that this international order, especially since 2014-16, this international order is in decline and even disorder. So if you look at Vardai Club's annual report, every year since 2013, it made it clear that this international order will only do damage to Russia, will not accept Russia. So why should Russia join them? Essentially, this war is about how Russia can survive and how Russia can get rid of this so-called US-led international order so that it can, not only survive, but develop. In this regard, it is not surprising that the United States and the West go wholeheartedly, go up all the way, support Ukraine. So it's not a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's a war between Russia and the US-led international system, international order. In that regard, this kind of, referendum and this kind of war is really beyond Ukraine. We have to understand that. Ukraine is just, in my view, being used in this regard. Having said that, I do believe that the existing international order will be severely damaged or have a heavy blow if Russia is being successful.
Let's move on. Global leaders are convening in New York for the 77th session of the UN General Assembly this week. How has the Ukraine conflict been discussed, and how have countries been affected by the conflict? And what are the prospects for UN Security Council reform? Professor Huang Jing, the UN gathering is taking place, when the world is severely divided and faced with a series of crises, including the Ukraine conflict we just talked about, and climate change, energy shortage, food crisis, etc. So what is the top, issue probably for you, for the global leaders to work together to deal with?
I think obviously the number one priority in today's UN is how to stop the war in Ukraine and Russia-Ukraine. They have to, I think that the right way that they have to make a necessary compromise. I think 3 points. Number one, of course, I think the first one is to make sure that Russia and Ukraine will stop fighting at each other. I mean, ceasefire, that's necessary. And then sit down and have negotiation. We know that if you want peace, you have to negotiate. You cannot fight. I do not believe, frankly, I do not really believe that either Ukraine side or Russian side can achieve what they want through war. That is very dangerous because, Russia is mentioned before, is a nuclear power, and it, in order to defend itself, from their point of view, it justifies for them to use all means of weapons to defend themselves because they think they've been violated. Of course, Ukraine feel the same way because the fight is on their ground. So before we want to stop this, first let's do not push anymore. Let's propose that both sides ceasefire first. And second, of course, we have to look into history. We have to look at the fact that if I want my country to be secure, we have to also make sure my security will not threaten other people's security. Let's be secure all the time together as a so-called collective security. You cannot establish your security at the expenses of other securities. I think also discuss about that. Last but not the least, I do believe that the UN should be a platform. People put their demand and interest on board and discuss it, not let some country to dominate the platform, only make their voice be heard in the assembly.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anna, what's the top issue, for you probably, for today's world to deal with, for the sake of, I would say, the welfare of every country?
Well, while the Ukraine, the situation is getting top billing, the fact is that innocent parties, the developing and emerging third world, are the ones who are going to suffer for what is in essence as we said before, a geopolitical, competition between the U.S. and what it perceives are its rivals. So at this juncture, you heard from the global South. They were all concerned. Their concerns were about food, energy, jobs, economic development, and having a plan to address that. Fell on deaf ears. Only thing people could seem to do is stand up and applaud wildly when Zelensky made his televised appearance. This is not what the UN is for. It's not a talk shop for assigning blame to other groups. It's supposed to put together, some sort of solution, suggest a way in which the parties can sit down, where peer pressure can be applied to both sides so that they reach some sort of agreement that will spare everybody, in this case, the people of Ukraine and Russia and the rest of the world, the kind of misery that we're in for.
Professor Toker, President Joe Biden of the United States, also made a speech at UN saying that, they are not pressuring other countries to choose a side. But obviously, developing countries are feeding the pressure to choose sides, between Russia and the West, Russia, Ukraine, for example, on that. As this is a top priority, what any suggestion? How can we proceed from here to solve this problem, not only for Russia, Ukraine, Russia, West, and the whole world?
Yes, indeed, the Ukrainian-Russian war, we have to admit it, had hijacked the General Assembly debates. Now, that's not the first precedent in which a major world crisis does that in terms of all the other elements which are on world agenda. And my colleague in Beijing actually described it very well and really pointed at where priorities could be, should be, and may still be. But when you have such a major war, when you have so many interests at stake, and when you have world mobilization in terms of major powers, well, once again, the weaker ones find themselves on the victim side in terms of their daily needs and immediate interests. Now, the UN basically, when you look at the documents, when you look at the intentions which were put along decades into what the UN can do to our world, there are possibilities to use the UN even during a crisis moment in order to improve, at least relatively, the situation of all world partners, of all countries. Will there be sufficient political availability to do this? The signs are not very optimistic right now. Sure enough, President Biden, as you mentioned, but also President Macron of France and British and German leaders are trying to influence, to put pressure on countries in Africa, in South America, in some parts of Asia, so that they do take sides when it comes to this major crisis, to the war, in the hope that such a pressure put on Moscow would indeed result in a more moderate, if I should say so, although moderate, I'm not sure is the right adjective to use here, and would push towards more rational solutions, which to a large extent depend on President Putin's availability to such more moderate solutions. So it's not just, trying to tell countries in Africa and Latin America, let's forget your problems and your priorities right now because we have a huge stakes there over the battlefield in Ukraine. It's also a way of trying to put pressure on Moscow, because through pressure in Moscow, things may get slightly, perhaps less alarming. And in this sense, I would say it is not being spelled out all over the place.
Professor Huang Jing, the countries like Germany and France, they are calling for the reform of the UN Security Council. Many people say that's in response of the resolving of the Ukraine issue, let's say. They would say, oh, Russia has a veto power over there, so let's reform it. But some others would say this is basically the lack of cooperation among the big powers, US, China, Russia, France, Germany, European Union. It's not really about reforming the UN Security Council?
I think the first and foremost, if one major member or major country, that is United States, sees the other two as enemies or as rivals, try to contain or destroy, how can we have unity at the UN Security Council? This is a problem. But I mean, if you really want to make this Security Council work, at least you should see each other as partners. Of course, they have different way of life. They have different political systems. They have a different view of what's going on. They have different predictions of the future world. That's fine. We're all different. But if you set up so that you are my enemies, I'm going to destroy you. This kind of attitude, how can you have unity first? And second, I think it's very ironic that all the UN national social security, not all Security Council members, frankly speaking, may not want to expand or enlarge the Security Council because it's against their interests. This is a very ironic situation. Of course, you can argue that Germany should be in, Japan should be in, and India should be in. But if you ask every one of the 5 security member countries, if they agree or not, they may have a huge difference as well, huge common interests to prevent the extra members in the Security Council. This is where the difficulty is. So I think the issue is not how to reform the UN Security Council, is how to make sure the 30 members of Security Council will work with each other. Without them working with each other, any agenda will be a waste of time. It will not work at all.
Well, on that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.